There is a moment, it arrives quietly, usually in the middle of something ordinary, when a grown adult realizes they are still waiting for a nod of approval that has never quite come, or still arranging their entire life around a single silent vow: I will not become them. The waiting can be years old, the vow can be decades old, and yet both are operating right now underneath whatever else is happening. Underneath the career choices and the relationship patterns and the particular way a person reacts when someone raises their voice in a room. Most of us did not actually grow up with parents. We grew up with gods, figures so large they blocked the sun, too powerful to question, too present to escape, too defining to simply set down. And what happens with a god is that you either worship or you rage. There is no third option. You organize yourself around devotion or you organize yourself around revolt. Either way, the god remains at the center of the story, enormous, determining everything. This is why forgiveness for so many people never quite lands, because you cannot forgive a god. You can only submit to one or spend your lifetime arguing with one. Real forgiveness, the kind that actually changes something inside you, requires a human being standing across from you. An ordinary, limited, sometimes broken human being. Not a deity and not a demon. A person. To understand how we got here, it helps to understand something about the parts of us that formed long before we had any words for what was happening. Think of what you might call the unconscious as the building's infrastructure hidden behind its walls. The load-bearing beams, the electrical wiring, the water pipes, none of it visible from any room, all of it determining what the building can hold and how it responds to every storm. Your parents shaped that infrastructure before you had any say in the blueprints. Because children do not choose their parents. They are swallowed by them. In those earliest years, there is no ego yet. No part of you that wakes up in the morning with a name, a plan, and a clear idea about who you are, the conscious tenant in a house whose foundations were poured by someone else. That tenant barely exists yet. The child lives inside the parent's emotional weather, the way a creature lives in an aquarium, completely immersed, unable to see the glass, taking the water for the world. And in that immersion, an image forms, an inner picture of who this enormous person is, what they mean, what they demand, whether the world is safe or dangerous, whether love comes with conditions or without. That image hardens. It sets. Long before the child has any capacity to examine it, it has already become a verdict on reality. The problem is that the verdict tends to outlast its original conditions. The god your nervous system constructed at age 4 is still on the throne at 44, collecting tribute or absorbing blame, while the actual person, limited, wounded, ordinary, probably carrying their own unexamined image of their own parents, stands somewhere in the background, almost unrecognizable. You can spend a lifetime in that arrangement, punishing a god who no longer exists, waiting for absolution from a god who never could have given it. What this episode offers instead is a way through 3 movements. First, understanding how parents become gods in the first place. Then, the specific grief and unexpected relief that comes from seeing them as human. And finally, the paradox at the center of all of it, that the only thing that makes forgiveness truly possible is finding your own ground to stand on. So here is where it actually begins. Not with the parent, but with the architecture that was already in place before they ever held you. A barely conscious infant does not experience a person. It has no capacity for that yet. What it experiences is a force of nature. The mother is warmth and nourishment and the end of pain and the arrival of terror, all at once, undifferentiated, total. The father is law, power, the horizon and the danger at the horizon's edge. These are not perceptions a child forms the way an adult forms an opinion. They are environments. The infant does not observe the mother. The infant lives inside the mother, experience the way a creature lives inside weather. And here is where the pattern enters. An archetype is like the template pressed into wet clay before any individual pot is formed. Every culture's pots look different, but they were all pressed from the same ancient mold. Your parents stepped into those molds the moment you were born. The pattern was older than them. The mother image and the father image your child self encountered were not blueprints your particular parents invented. They were inherited shapes, pressed into the species over thousands of generations of human experience, wired into your inner life before you drew a first breath. This is the crucial distinction, and everything about forgiveness depends on grasping it. What the child falls into is not merely the personal mother or the personal father. It is the archetype behind them. The actual woman and the actual man become the screen. And what gets cast onto that screen is ancient, enormous, and charged with a kind of power no single human being could ever have generated on their own. Which is where projection enters. Projection works the way a movie projector does. The image originates inside the machine, gets cast outward onto whatever surface is nearby, and the audience spends the entire film believing the story is happening on the screen. When you are still carrying your parents as gods, the story is always happening on them, not in you. The anger lives inside you, but it looks like it belongs entirely to them. The longing lives inside you, but it seems to be a hunger only they could fill. The image travels outward so automatically, so completely, that there is no experience of it leaving. There is only the screen. When you are angry at a father for being cold and withholding, you are partly angry at the father archetype, the ancient image of boundless authority and unshakable moral strength, the figure who was supposed to stand at the center of the world like a fixed point. No human being can be that. The real man was standing in for something enormous that was never his to carry. He was recruited into a role that predated him by millennia, and whatever he was actually like. Cautious, distracted, frightened, generous in his own limited way, none of it was ever quite visible because the image kept landing on top of him. The mother carries the same impossible weight in the other direction. She was not experienced as a person with her own exhaustion and her own interior life. She was experienced as the source of all warmth and all belonging and all safety, and when she turned, as something devouring and total. That is the collective mother image, older than any individual woman, drawn from every fire that was ever kept burning through the night and every darkness that ever swallowed what the light could not protect. The collective unconscious is the groundwater layer beneath every individual mind, invisible to any single person digging their own well, yet feeding every well in the valley from the same underground source. Your parents were drawing from that source. So were you. And so, if you look at the earliest pictures any culture has ever made of its gods, you will find the same architecture. The thundering father in the sky, the nourishing earth mother. The inner picture of God and the inner picture of the parent were formed from the same material, because they were. When the actual person carries too much of this charge, they disappear behind it. Something below consciousness knows this is wrong. In the inner life of someone too fused with a parent, something sometimes manufactures images that quietly diminish or demystify that figure. Not out of cruelty, but because some deep intelligence is trying to force the first steps of becoming yourself. And here is what that points toward. The full weight of nurturer, guide, lawgiver, and source of all belonging was never meant to rest on two people. Humanity has always known this, which is why there have always been godparents, elders, teachers, and priests, a community of figures to distribute what no single pair of shoulders could hold. Your parents were always too small for what you needed them to be, because what you needed was not them. You needed the archetype. The work of forgiveness begins the moment you can finally see the difference between the image and the person standing behind it. The image and the person are not the same thing. You know this intellectually the moment someone says it, but knowing it intellectually is entirely different from feeling it operate in real time, from noticing, in the middle of a phone call or a holiday dinner, that the face you are looking at has gathered around itself an enormous amount of material that the actual person in front of you did not put there. What is gathered is a complex. A complex is like an old emotional injury that healed badly, not just a scar, but a knot of tissue that pulls slightly wrong with every movement, that aches in particular weather, that you have learned to protect so automatically you no longer remember doing it. The parental complex formed in those first years is one of the earliest knitting and deepest set of all. It is not the parent. It is the deposit left by the parent, layered over with every unmet longing you brought to them, every fear you projected onto their ambiguous silences, every childhood interpretation of moments they probably do not even remember. The actual person and what your inner life has built around them have been fused for so long that distinguishing them feels almost violent, like separating two things that have grown together. The beginning of seeing your parent clearly is the beginning of that separation, and it requires admitting something uncomfortable, that the image you carry is partly your own creation. The mother who could never do anything right in your story, or the father who was always just out of reach. These figures absorbed your unmet needs, your ancient longings, your privately held verdicts about what love should look like. That is not their fault, and it is not yours, but it is something you are responsible for undoing. The inner life has its own way of trying to force this undoing. When your waking life overcommits to a single story about a parent, whether that story is adoration or condemnation, something below consciousness begins to move in the opposite direction. Compensation is the way a ship's ballast works, invisible to the passengers, automatically shifting weight in the hold as the vessel tilts, keeping the whole thing from going over. The person who has decided their mother was a saint starts dreaming of suffocation. The person who has spent 20 years in clean contempt for their father finds themselves moved, without explanation, by something he said at a funeral. The inner life is trying to restore balance. It will keep trying. There is also something more intimate running underneath all of this. Between parents and children, there is a bond deeper than affection, a kind of psychological fusion in which the inner lives of parent and child are genuinely entangled. Children absorb the unlived material of their parents, the grief their father never allowed himself, the ambition their mother buried when she was 19, the rage that was never expressed, the tenderness that was never permitted. These things do not simply disappear. They get handed down the way objects get handed down, not through intention, not through conversation, but through the atmosphere of a household, through what was permitted and what was not, through what was mourned and what was simply never spoken of. You may be living out something that was never truly yours to begin with. Think of a young man who was intellectually capable but emotionally frozen. Brilliant in analysis, articulate about everything except what he actually wanted. Every real decision in his life, the career he half chose, the relationship he held at arm's length, the projects he could never quite begin, orbited a single point, an inner picture of his mother as flawless, devoted, permanently available. She had needed him to be her confidant, her small anchor, when he was too young to understand the weight of that role. He had complied because he had no alternative, and over the years the compliance had become invisible to him. He thought he was simply choosing caution. He was not choosing anything. He was living inside an image. Humanization for him arrived slowly, not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Noticing that she deflected rather than listened. Seeing, finally, the exhaustion behind the warmth. Recognizing in her silences the same fear he carried in his own. Slowly, with enormous reluctance, withdrawing what he had cast onto her, taking back the perfection he had attributed to her, taking back the need he had made her responsible for, and finding for the first time that he was the one holding it. What comes with humanization is grief. This is not a metaphor, and it should not be softened. When you begin to see a parent as a person rather than as the figure they were supposed to be, something genuinely dies. What dies is the possibility. The fantasy that they might still become what they never were. The hope, held somewhere quietly for decades, that the right conversation or the right moment might finally deliver what was missing. Real mourning is required here, the kind that acknowledges an actual loss, not a misunderstanding. The loss is real. The thing you were waiting for was never going to come. That deserves to be grieved properly. And then, underneath the grief, something else. When the god finally stops being a god, you stop being a subject. The enormous figure shrinks to human scale, not diminished exactly, but accurate. And in that accuracy, something shifts. You become, perhaps for the first time, full size. The energy that was locked in the image, all of it yours, all of it belonging to you, begins to return. This is where identification enters as its own kind of complication. Identification is like inheriting a coat that was worn by someone else for decades. their shape pressed into the shoulders, their perfume still in the lining. You put it on as a child because you had nothing else to wear in the cold. The difficulty is that as you grow, the coat begins to feel like skin, and removing it feels like removing yourself. The child who identified with a depressed father carries that depression as though it were her own character. The son who merged with a mother's anxiety runs his entire life as if disaster is always approximately 90 seconds away. Separating is not betrayal, but it feels like it. Every oldest story about a person leaving home carries both things at once, the shame and the exultation arriving together, inseparable. Because they are describing something true about what it costs to become a self. And what you find on the other side is strange and worth naming. The only people who can genuinely find family are those who no longer need family to be perfect. As long as you need your parent to fill the shape of the archetype, to be the inexhaustible source, the law, the fixed point, you cannot actually see them. The image is in the way, but when you stop needing them to complete something in you, they become available. Not as gods, not as the answers to the questions you formed at age 4, but as humans, with their own limits, their own story, their own failed and partial attempts at love. People who did what they could with what they had, inside the same current of inherited material that is flowing through you now. That is not a small thing to see. It is, in fact, the only way in, not through the image, through the person. So you have seen through the image. You have caught the moment where the projected figure and the actual person begin to separate. That is not the end of the work. It is the beginning of a different kind. The kind that requires you to move deliberately in a specific direction. Forgiveness is not an event. It is not something that arrives after sufficient reflection or unlocks at the end of a good conversation with a therapist, or happens in a single afternoon by a window somewhere when you finally feel ready. It is a direction, a set of incremental moves, each of which costs something. What you are dismantling, piece by piece, is the image itself. The first move is the most precise and most people skip it. Ask yourself, when you bring your mother or father to mind, whether you are actually seeing them, or whether you are seeing your inner picture of them. The figure assembled across years of need and disappointment and longing, enlarged by everything they could not give you. Take one specific expectation, just one. What did you need them to have been that they were not? Steady, available, proud of you without conditions. Name it plainly, because that expectation almost never points to a simple personal failure. It points to an archetypal wound, a place where the actual human being was too small to fill the shape of what you required. Part of what makes this hard is that the wound lives in the body before it lives in the mind. There is something that gets called the emotional climate your body learned during the earliest years. Not a memory you can recall, but a weather system you carry everywhere. The automatic tightening when someone goes quiet. The flooding relief when someone is finally warm. The low-grade vigilance tuned to the particular frequency of her presence or her absence. That is not the same as your mother. It is what her particular pattern of love and withdrawal installed in you before you had language for any of it. Recognizing the weather system as something you carry, not as the truth about her, is the second move. There is an equivalent structure installed by the father, something like an internalized jury that convenes in the back of your mind whenever you are evaluating whether what you have done is enough. A voice trained on his particular silences, his particular standards, his particular way of arriving or not arriving when you needed him. That jury is not him. It is a construction, and it has likely been ruling on cases he never even knew about. Promotions, relationships, quiet moments at 2 a.m. when no one else is watching. Seeing the jury as a jury rather than as objective law is the third move. Then comes the grief. The thing most people believe they are angry about is not actually what their parents did. It is what the God behind them failed to deliver. The inexhaustible source that ran dry. The law that turned out to be arbitrary. The fixed point that moved. That grief is enormous, and it is legitimate, and it belongs to you. You have to actually grieve it, not explain it, not reframe it, not decide it made you stronger. Grieve the thing that did not come. After the grief, look for what you are still waiting for. Because many people are not angry at their parents at all. They are waiting for a recognition that has never come, arranging their whole life into a series of auditions for an audience of one who may not even be watching anymore. Recognizing the wait is the first step toward ending it. Then look for the inheritance, not just the wound. The particular damage your parents carried created particular capacities in you. Attunements, durability, ways of seeing that people with easier childhoods sometimes never develop. Nothing they handed you was purely one thing. Here is the obstruction that stops all of this: inflation. When it lands on a parent's image, the ordinary person expands to fill the whole frame of your sky. A single criticism becomes a verdict. A single absence becomes proof of worthlessness. The parent has become too large to be real and too large to be forgiven. The final move is this: stop requiring your parent to be either God or demon. Let them be the size they actually are. You can be angry at a person. You can grieve a person. You can eventually understand one. You cannot do any of those things with a God. The forgiveness that is available to you, the real kind, not the performance of it, only becomes possible when the figure in front of you is finally actually human. When you were small, you could not have seen them clearly. You did not have the equipment. The earliest love is always larger than life because the child is smaller than life, and what they see is necessarily magnified. Your parent filled the doorframe. Their mood was the weather. Their approval was oxygen. That was not distortion. That was the only way a small person can perceive a large world. But you are not small anymore. The real forgiveness, the kind that actually does something, is not pretending the damage was minor. It is not manufacturing warmth you do not feel. It is the slow, sometimes painful work of bringing them down from the throne or out of the dungeon to ground level, where human encounters are finally possible, where something true can happen between two people of comparable size. Here is the paradox. The ones who have genuinely done the work of separation, who have stopped requiring their parents to be perfect or monstrous, are the only ones who can find something real with them. Because they are no longer in a conversation with a God, they are in a conversation with a person, and a person's limits are comprehensible, ordinary, survivable. You can carry the weight of a person's limits without it defining everything that comes after. Not as a wound you protect from the air, but as a weight you know the shape of. One you can set down when you need to. At some point in the long work of growing up, you stop waiting for the light to come through the door. You find the switch. That is not abandonment. That is not giving up. That is the beginning of love that costs something real and means something real in return. Carry that with you today. It does not have to be finished to be useful.